I'm Hazem Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, on a slippery slope, no-shows and gloomy predictions set the tone for this year's World Economic Forum in Davos. Why the Chinese president is talking about black swans and grey rhinos as the world's #2 economy slows. Plus, who's paying the price for the longest government shutdown in American history? Well, every year, the World Economic Forum in Davos is a chance for leaders from across the globe to talk about the biggest challenges facing the planet. But this gathering was notable for those who didn't make it to the Swiss Alps. US President Donald Trump, China's Xi Jinping, and the UK's Theresa May were among them. Pressing problems back home kept many of them away. But for those who came, there was plenty to talk about. The International Monetary Fund cut its global growth forecast. China's economy grew at the slowest pace in 28 years. And according to Oxfam, the world's 26 richest people are worth as much as the poorest half of humanity. While some question the way it arrived at those numbers, more people fear that a widening wealth gap is ripping apart the social contract on which the world economy is built. Jonah Hull has more from Davos.
A chill has settled over Davos, and that's not just the weather. Leaders of some of the world's biggest economies, China, the United States, France and the UK, have stayed away to fight crises at home. Crises fuelled by nationalism, populism and those left behind by globalisation. It is everything the World Economic Forum is supposed to stand against, and yet this year's big-ticket visitor is Brazil's new president, far-right nationalist Jair Bolsonaro, here to launch what he calls a new Brazil.
We intend to reduce the size of the Brazilian state apparatus and carry out reforms such as the social security reform and also the tax reform. We wish to relieve those who produce and undertake business and projects from the weight of a heavy state.
That's good news for business, less so for those who depend on state aid. It's an odd look for an annual gathering traditionally built on bridging divides.
It does say that there's a bit of a shift and that those major leading democracies in the world are exhausted, tied in knots, have problems. But it also says this community here of globalists is perfectly willing to flirt with illiberal leaders in the world.
Compensation came in the heavyweight fight against climate change, identified as a major world threat. Having heard Bolsonaro's call for economic development in the Amazon, delegates listened to royalty interviewing a British knight of the realm.
What advice do you have for my generation, and what can we build on that you have started?
We have to recognise that every breath of air we take, every mouthful of food that we take comes from the natural world. And that if we damage the natural world, we damage ourselves.
It's what the Forum aims to do best, global box office in the name of a better world. The theme of this year's World Economic Forum here in Davos is the fourth wave of globalization, the digital revolution. It predicts a world in which technology competes with workers of all stripes, blue collar and white, in which the winners of globalization get ever richer, but fewer in number. It is a world in which inequality deepens and political leaders no longer have all the answers.
Well, joining me now from London is Jeremy Cook, Chief Economist and Head of Currency Strategy at money transfer provider World First. Thanks very much for being with us. So lots to talk about for those who were gathered in Davos this week, not the least of which is this International Monetary Fund outlook for the global economy, warning of a global economic slowdown. How likely is that in your view?
Well, the start to 2019, certainly in markets, has been particularly rocky. And the data that we've been getting from the two largest economies in the world, US and China, has been poor. So certainly we haven't started out on a strong footing. And the IMF is warning about scenarios and also the results of economic pressures that we've seen throughout the course of 2008, which will likely be brought to bear over the course of the next 12 months or so. A lot of it is focused on politics. A lot of it is focused on the trade fallout between the US and China and how that ripples around the global economy. Obviously, there's a focus on Brexit as well, and just the rise of protectionism that we are seeing in some of our dialogue around global trade. So the IMF is warning that if this is not arrested soon, then the global economy, which is just in 2017 and 2018 was starting to build, starting to become a little bit more solid, is already at risk.
We got some disappointing numbers on the Chinese economy this week. The biggest slowdown in the second biggest economy in the world in nearly 30 years. And we have Chinese President Xi Jinping warning in a speech of what he calls black swans and grey rhinoceroses. What does he mean by that?
It's simply put a warning that things can come out of the ether very, very quickly, even for an economy the size of China's, and obviously an economy that has been running at such huge amounts of growth for such a long, long time. Now, I don't think there's anyone really out there who's naturally predicting a recession in China. You know, most economies would still kill for a growth rate of 6%. So the slowing is the story more than a sudden stop and a reversal. But this is a continual pull by the Chinese government to emphasize to both international investors and businesses who are either Chinese or have operations within China, the government support will be there to allow further stimulus to continue the growth picture that they have been seeing. Now, that may be a cut in interest rates by the People's Bank of China. It may be allowing banks to simply lend more money. It may be a devaluation of the currency, although I don't think that would happen. But I think it's more a domestic and international message to make sure that no one feels that the Chinese authorities are in any way asleep at the wheel at the moment.
And this whole issue of global inequality is an ongoing concern. And Oxfam put out its annual report, but there are questions about the methodology used to compile those figures. What's your view on that?
It's always difficult when looking at these big macro surveys as to wealth predominantly either away from developing nations, or how much of a developing nation or a continent's wealth can be seen against the stock portfolio of someone who happens to own a very, very valuable e-commerce business. And there's always a difference between stocks and flows and growth thereof. Obviously, there is no doubt that there are very, very poor people in a lot of the world, and there is no doubt that there are people out there who have a huge, almost unsurmountable amount of wealth that could be spent better, as opposed to sitting on a business's balance sheet. We heard out of Davos over the course of the week that a lot of people are starting to talk about wealth taxes, whether this is an increase in taxes to 70%, as the Democratic Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been talking about, and what likely impact that would have on wealth creation in some of the richest economies out there. Davos isn't going to solve inequality over the course of a 4-day period in a very, very exclusive ski resort. The rich will continue to get richer. Hopefully, government moves over the course of progressive tax regimes will allow the poor, however, to be able to catch up a little bit.
Good to speak with you. Jeremy Cook, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, a warning from Airbus over the risks of a no-deal Brexit. Airbus employs more than 14,000 people at 25 sites across the UK.
Please don't listen to the Brexiteers' madness, which asserts that because we have huge plants here, we will not move and we will always be here. They are wrong. Of course, it is not possible to pick up and move our large UK factories to other parts of the world immediately. However, aerospace is a long-term business, and we could be forced to redirect future investments in the event of a no-deal Brexit. And make no mistakes, there are plenty of countries out there who would love to build the wings for Airbus aircraft.
And with all the uncertainty over Brexit, some people in the UK are beginning to stockpile basic necessities, including food and medicine. A company in Leeds has been selling a Brexit box billed as a 30-day survival kit. Lawrence Lee reports.
These are really good.
Linda is taking no chances. She bought her Brexit box a few weeks ago. Inside is enough freeze-dried food to last a month. She isn't rich, It cost her £300, nearly $400. But she has no regrets. She supports leaving the European Union as soon as possible. Remain supporters would say, you're a bit crazy, you know, why don't we just stay in the European Union and then you don't have to eat packets and tins like this? You think it's the price we're paying in that sense?
I can see what they're saying that, and I can understand why Remainers want to remain. But I'm looking more long term. I want democracy back for my children and grandchildren. I don't want to go down the route that it looks like where we're being dictated to how things need to be.
James supplies the Brexit boxes. He's traditionally done business with aid agencies dealing in disaster relief. In recent weeks, he's seen a big uptick in sales inside the UK. A year's supply for a family costs more than $20,000.
We've got a no-deal scenario which is possibly going to cause a hiccup in the customs system. At the moment, nobody knows what to get ready for, not even the customs guys, so there can't be any plans put into place properly. And so there's always going to be a disruption for at least the first 3 to 4 weeks whilst they try and sort out what they're doing, possibly longer if they need to do further infrastructure.
The inexorable logic of a no-deal Brexit means fresh food, which would normally come from places like the Dutch port of Rotterdam, getting stuck and rotting in lorries before it can reach supermarkets. Several have already said they too are stockpiling tinned or non-perishable foods, though they acknowledge they could run out in little over a week. Empty shelves and panic buying seem inevitable. It's become common for politicians who support a hard Brexit to say, well, so what if we can't have bananas and tomatoes for a while? The country's been through much worse. What for some seems an entirely pointless exercise, a sort of self-imposed blockade, is for many others a small price to pay for getting rid of the malign influence of the European Union. Yorkshire voted leave in the Brexit referendum by a small margin. This part of the country is known for its grit and determination. If no deal is as bad as many fear, if food or medicines do start to run out, they may very well need it.
All right, still to come on Counting the Cost, how building a boat clad in flip-flops is raising awareness of a serious issue. But first, a week of turmoil for Venezuela. Some world leaders are saying they'll recognize Juan Guaido, the head of the National Assembly, as the interim president. Opposition efforts to replace Nicolas Maduro with a transitional government have been having an impact on the bond market. Nearly all of Venezuela's $60 billion worth of international bonds are in default. But this week, Venezuelan government and state oil company PDVSA bonds posted their biggest gains in a year. Investors are betting a change of government will help fix the world's worst performing economy. But any new government will want to review deals made by its predecessor with Russia and China. We'll be looking at that next week in our special focus on Venezuela. Who are its biggest creditors and what does the future hold for people there? Here in the Middle East, Qatar is buying up $500 million worth of Lebanese government bonds. Qatar, which remains under a Saudi Arabian-led land, sea and air blockade, sees it as a good investment which will help stabilize the economy. Lebanon has the third highest debt to GDP in the world, and 8 months on from an election, politicians there still can't agree to form a government. Moody's lowered Lebanon's credit score further below investment grade on Monday. The ratings agency cited risks the government may default on repayments. And the first foldable 5G smartphone, the Chinese telecoms giant Huawei, said it is launching it next month using its very own technology. Huawei is facing restrictions in several Western countries over concerns its products could be used for spying. The company's chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, continues to fight extradition to the U.S. She denies accusations the company illegally broke U.S. sanctions against Iran. France slapped a $57 million fine on Google this week. It is the first major penalty brought against the U.S. technology company since new EU privacy rules came into force. Regulators said the search engine giant failed to fully disclose to users how their personal information is used. Now, from unpaid Coast Guard members to absent airport screeners, more Americans are feeling the pain of the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. But President Trump and the Democrats appear no closer to ending the political deadlock over the funding for a proposed wall along the border with Mexico. Rob Reynolds reports.
A month of shutdown, gridlock, and political posturing. A month of misery for 800,000 government employees going without pay. In a sign of just how bad things are now, Kraft Foods Corporation opened a grocery pop-up store in Washington, giving away cheese, macaroni, mayonnaise, and so on to cash-strapped federal workers. The pain spreads across the country, on Coast Guard bases, at research laboratories, along the borders, and in airports. The partial government shutdown is hurting families and disrupting vital government functions. For example, the Transportation Security Agency reported that about 10% of its airport security screeners have been unable to report to work due to financial hardships.
We have to have an evidence-based conversation.
President Donald Trump and Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi are no closer to an agreement.
I am here today to break the logjam.
On Saturday, Trump offered temporary protection to about 1 million undocumented immigrants in exchange for funding his wall.
The plan includes $5.7 billion for a strategic deployment of physical barriers, or a wall.
Democrats said no way, saying Trump must agree to end the shutdown before they'll talk about border security. Both sides have resorted to jabs, jibes, and juvenile antics. Speaker Pelosi suggested Trump dump plans for a televised State of the Union speech during the shutdown. In retaliation, Trump snatched away military aircraft Pelosi planned to use for a trip to Afghanistan.
That kind of pettiness, it does nothing for the American people, and it has reached a high water mark in my experience, and I've been here almost 50 years.
Polls show Americans are weary of the dysfunction in D.C. About 60% in a recent poll disapprove of Trump's handling of the shutdown. The economic damage is mounting. According to the financial services company Standard & Poor's, the U.S. gross domestic product loses $1.2 billion each week the government is closed, or about $1,984 a second. Jamie Dimon, who runs J.P. Morgan Chase, the biggest bank in the U.S., says if the shutdown persists, it will reduce growth to zero. Maybe everybody should start stocking up on that mac and cheese.
Well, joining me now from London is Russ Mould, Investment Director at stockbrokers AJ Bell. Thanks for being with us. So we've heard so many of these stories about unpaid government employees having to sell their possessions and going on GoFundMe pages and missing their payments and so on. Talk us through the effect that this is having on the US economically the longer this goes on.
Well, one of the ironies is at the moment it's quite hard for us to tell. Because of the government shutdown, we aren't getting the normal, regular, monthly economic data that we would expect. So some of the releases that we could use to judge the US economy aren't available. The one that we have seen, an independent survey on American consumer confidence from the University of Michigan, that's just reached its lowest level during the Trump presidency. So it does seem to be starting to have some effect, and a negative effect.
One of the things that is affecting at the moment is this government's agency, the Small Business Administration, can't process new loans. That's having a really bad effect on small businesses, isn't it?
You would certainly expect so. I mean, credit is the lifeblood of many economies. So if small companies can't get access to it, they probably have limited resources of their own. It is a potential negative. It'll be interesting to see, again, if this starts to show up in some of the smaller company sentiment surveys that the American government publishes, as and when it gets around to publishing them, which at the moment, unfortunately, it isn't.
And there's no doubt that this shutdown is bad for the economy, but there's varying estimates at the moment on just how bad. Some say if it lasts till the end of January, it could knock a half a percentage point off of economic growth. What's your view on this? And could this lead to a recession as well?
Well, that's a really good question, because I mean, lots of economists were worrying about a recession last year anyway. Those fears have been proven unfounded. But a White House Economic Advisory Council member, Kevin Hassett, he actually gave some numbers out on Wednesday, saying he thought that for each week that the shutdown continued would knock around 1/8 of a percentage point off US GDP growth. Now, there aren't many forecasts out for the first quarter at the moment, The New York Federal Reserve is forecasting 2.2% growth. So if you take Mr. Hassett's number literally, multiply that by all 13 weeks of the first quarter, you're certainly looking at US GDP growth decelerating to no more than 1% in the first quarter if those other estimates are correct. So that would be the worst number since late 2015.
And what effect is this having on investor sentiment in the US? Obviously, it was a rough year, 2018. Many people took some big losses there. How nervous are investors about the effect that this is going to have on the overall health of the economy?
At the moment, they seem remarkably calm. The S&P 500 index, one of America's major stock market benchmarks, is actually up by 5% this year. Now, as you say, that's a big rally after the hammering that a lot of stocks took in the fourth quarter last year, but there seems to be still some confidence that this is a short-term problem. Now, admittedly, Speaker Pelosi in the House of Representatives, a Democrat, has raised the temperature again by forbidding President Trump from giving the State of the Union speech on the 29th of January. So that's the next step. Maybe she will be hoping that provokes some form of compromise from the president. And in the end, the president himself seems to be equating the success of his term with how the US stock market does. So you would expect him to want to start to find some sort of solution at some stage. But at the moment, share market investors have got lots of other things to worry about. Oddly enough, it doesn't seem to be the shutdown.
Do you think that this will set a precedent, though, for the future, if and when this is resolved, that mechanisms will then be put in place in the US governing system to prevent anything like this happening again? That if there's any sort of political deadlock, you can't use the US budget as a weapon anymore?
Well, in theory, Congress could present President Donald Trump with a bill and ask him to take it or leave it. So there are things that Congress can do. This is the balancing mechanism that America has through its bicameral system, the presidency. So there are multiple authorities which mean that one power can't become too dominant over all of the others. So I think the checks and balances are there. The current unfortunate situation is we have a very, very combative situation in Washington where the two political parties are probably farther apart than they've been for a very, very long time. I think the system seems to work pretty well. At the moment, it's the people who are operating it who aren't perhaps using it to its best effect.
Russ Mould, good to speak with you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And finally, it washes up on beaches and creates giant floating waste patches in the sea. The UN estimates that by 2050, there'll be more plastic than fish unless the industry cleans up its act. Mohammed Addo reports now from Lamu, Kenya, on an unusual project aimed at raising awareness.
This is the boat at the heart of what is being hailed as a plastic revolution. Flip-Floppy, as it's called, is the world's first dhow made entirely of recycled ocean plastic recovered from the beaches of Kenya's coastal towns. The boat was built here in Lamu, home of traditional Swahili dhow building, and it's overseen by this man, Ali Skanda, and his team of craftsmen.
Our big dream was to have a big dhow going up to Cape Town around the world, but then according to the challenge, we met it. We had this prototype to experience ourselves and to prove ourselves that we can do it.
For a long time, this tiny Kenyan island was untouched by the outside world. Lamu is now at the receiving end of a global tide of plastic pollution. A community of a few thousand people dealing with the problem of washed up waste, which begins its journey thousands of kilometers away. And according to the latest scientific studies, the scale of the problem is much bigger than earlier thought. Plastic pollution is not just limited to the East African coast. It's a global problem with huge patches of sea covered by plastic that is poisoning and strangling wildlife. The United Nations is now warning that there would be more plastic than fish in the sea by 2050 if drastic action is not taken. Those behind the Flip-Floppy boat say they are doing their part to raise awareness on the growing crisis of plastic pollution.
We basically want to showcase to the world what you can do if you use plastic sensibly. That you can give plastic a second life, but more importantly, that it does not make sense to have anything called single use. It simply does not make sense in this time and era to use something once and throw it away. The boat symbolizes that.
The boat is now on its maiden trip to the island of Zanzibar, 500 kilometers away. The team will be stopping at every village and town on their way to tell people of the dangers of plastic waste in the oceans. The ceremony to flag it off is marked with a beach soccer competition and a race between plastic waste boats built by some of Lamo's children. With the knowledge that plastic waste can be turned into something useful, the team, which has now partnered with the UN's Clean Seas program, says they are planning to build a much bigger dhow which can sail further afield and help in highlighting the potential of recycled plastic.
And that is our show for this week. Remember, you can get in touch with us by tweeting me at Hazem Seeker, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. Counting the cost at aljazeera.net is our address. But there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. So that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazem Seeker from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.